Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our 16th annual Private Foundation Symposium. Hello to those folks on Zoom. I hear there's a couple hundred of you folks out there. I'm sorry to say one of our foundation partners, Joe Ali, had back surgery this past week, so he will not be moderating the cyber area. So Scott Brown will be pitching in for him. So Joe, get healthy quick back home. A few things, just a couple housekeeping rules. For those folks on Zoom, there's going to be poll questions if you need CPE. Anybody that needs CPE, how things change. In the old days, up to a few years ago, you would have to sign in. Now you scan it. And automatically that will give you credits at the end of the day, assuming all the people that are on Zoom answer the polling questions that are going to pop up throughout. In the old days, we used to have a book that everybody received. Now you scan the outline, the book itself, and you have your own PowerPoint as we go through for people on Zoom as well as here be up on the screen. We have three presenters today. Paul Spivey is going to start off. Paul's going to talk about basically what's going on from a staffing issue today in the private foundation arena as well as the nonprofit arena. Taking a step back, when we go into an executive session now when we perform an audit of a financial statement of a private foundation, normally the two topics that always come up, one is cyber. It's been coming up the last few years. And the other one is staffing. For the first time, I think, ever within the last year, we see that there's openings that make it public, really, in private foundations. It used to be whispers that so-and-so executive director or CEO or president, whatever the title is going to be retiring next year. And before you know it, there was all calls and emails to that person. Hey, how can I be considered? And that's changing a little bit. And Paul's going to get into that dynamics and stuff. Regarding the cyber area, you may remember in the past, a few times we had folks from the FBI in speaking on that, what's going out there, how things changed. So we're tweaking that a little bit this year. We're going to be concentrating on cyber insurance, which is another hot topic. What's out there. Many times we'll go to different places and we'll see the premiums are all over the place. We'll see what the requisite is to get a good policy. And we would talk at the same time of what's going on in that arena. Kelly and Tom are going to get into that. Then finally, we call him Mr. IRS, and he's been cut short the last few years because we were running out of time. So this year we made sure there's ample time. Garrett Higgins is going to give us an update from the service, from the Attorney General's office, what we see out there from the IRS and what's coming down the road. To start off, Paul and I go way back, probably almost 20 years or so, working at various private foundations when he was actually the CEO of a foundation and involved on the board of the Council on Foundations. The last 10 years or so, you were at Phillips Oppenheim. We've been on the board of Exponent Philanthropy. I think when we were on it might have been called the Association of Small Foundations, and we changed the name to Exponent Philanthropy. Paul ended up being the chair. He's a good friend, and he's probably one of the most knowledgeable recruiters out there and sought after recruiters in the private foundation arena. Paul, come on up.
We'll leave it to all of you to determine how knowledgeable I am. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, a real privilege. And I've been involved with the firm and with Tom and his colleagues, especially Chris and Anand and others, for years. So it's really nice to be here. In fact, since I've been involved with Tom for over 20 years, I know he and his closest peer, Chris Peterman, have been involved for 40 years. Some whisper and say they make quite a cute couple. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, what I want to do today, first of all, I want to find out from all of you, how many of you are involved with foundations in some way or another, either a board member, a staff member, a consultant? Do many of you have connections with foundations? Yeah. Okay, so that's a good number, because my comments are going to be mainly focused on the philanthropic sector, although a lot of it can be applied to the broader nonprofit sector. So what I like to do is four things. I want to like set the context for where we are in a world that needs philanthropy. Two, speak about leadership, executive leaders. What kind of leaders do we need? And what are the trends in terms of leadership at the executive level? Three, talk about governance and talk about board leadership and what's needed for board leaders in order to advance philanthropy and some of the trends, things that are changing. And then four, to have some concluding comments, et cetera. So I just want to start by saying that when we set the context, we think about the fact that we're recovering from the human and economic losses of the pandemic, of COVID-19. And we're still feeling the effects of that. Coupled with that, internationally, the world is just blowing up with conflicts in the Middle East, in Russia and Ukraine, and troubled uncertainty in all places of the world, including like Iran, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, North Korea, China, everywhere. So there's a real time of crisis. And then if you think about the crisis in the Middle East and the rise in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, especially here in New York City, last week there were reported over 50 hate crimes as it relates to anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Additionally, on a local level in New York City, there's been a 20% increase in homelessness, an overall increase in those who are living in poverty, that are suffering from food insecurity and the like. So we've got a lot on hand. And what can philanthropy's role be in all of this? Well, the first thing, just for a quick second, is discuss about the meaning of philanthropy. Most people, when they think about philanthropy, they think about people coming together to help others who are inspired by humanity of love. They think about giving in a variety of ways, the three T's, either time, treasure, or talent, to make life better for others and to make life better for society. The thing about philanthropy is philanthropy can have a small role because actually the resources are small compared to what the government can provide, et cetera, but can have a meaningful role in influencing lasting social change and playing a critical role in supporting communities for a better future so that everybody can lead a productive life. Also, as I speak, if I say anything that's unclear, please don't hesitate to ask questions. That I would welcome that. So if we think about employment and employment in philanthropy, to ensure that people who are involved in philanthropy can have a social impact and make a difference, what kind of leaders does philanthropy need, and what is the best way to attract those leaders? So what I've done is I've put together a list of some of the qualities and values that are needed for philanthropic leaders, and then some of the skills and experiences. And then I'm going to explain the changes, how these factors have changed over time. But certainly in terms of qualities, and not every candidate's going to have all of these qualities, but the hope is that they'll have most. But you want somebody who's a lifelong learner, who's an active listener. I like to say a listening and learning leader. So that's a leader who's inquisitive, who's insightful, intuitive, analytical, can distill information clearly. Now here, this is a key thing, not just for philanthropy, but in terms of leadership in general, but is the notion of humility, that somebody who's not driven by ego, somebody for whom the ownership of and or credit for ideas is less important than the collective results. Somebody who can respect that ideas and solutions reside with community leadership. Honesty, transparency, integrity, judgment, these are all important. And clearly an earnest connection with a commitment to community and to the issues at hand, to the issues that the foundation may be focused on. It's clear that somebody who's naturally consultative, inclusive, who's a collaborator is important, and clearly somebody who believes in expanding access and opportunity and promoting equity. And the last thing I would say in terms of qualities is somebody who can grow, somebody who's adaptable and can anticipate inevitable changes in the landscape. So those are some of the qualities that I think are important. In terms of skills, and these are going to evolve, and I'll tell you how they evolve in a moment, but certainly a record of accomplishment as a manager, juggling multiple responsibilities from operations to finances, investments, program to managing staff and public relations. Somebody who's a seasoned experience with board relations, knows how to engage and partner with boards, knows how to win the trust of boards as a partner as it relates to finances and being a financial steward of the organization and with regard to strategic planning. Clearly, we want to see somebody who's had a record of advancing the mission of an organization, understanding how to do that, and being responsive to community responsiveness. So also, expertise is important, either content expertise or community expertise, relevant expertise in the focus area of a foundation, and understanding the broad needs of a community. Experience as a partner is important, a convener, a builder who can build coalitions and learn from it. That's really important. Somebody who can foster and inspire sensible partnerships and alliances and collaborations when applicable. And then, of course, as a leader, you want somebody who has coaching skills, who can facilitate board members and grantee partners and community members to come together to access their resourcefulness. And then also, it's important for somebody to have experience with technical assistance, with capacity building. That's key. And also, when you're a foundation, even though you have resources, you want to be able to leverage resources, leverage other resources, partner with other foundations who can co-fund and co-create programs. And lastly, you want to be an effective ambassador and spokesperson. So how do you get and keep the right leaders given the current trends? I'm going to talk about two recent major events that really have affected the way leaders are recruited and the types of leaders that are needed to be successful in philanthropy. One is obviously related to COVID, pre-COVID and post-COVID, and one is related to the murder of George Floyd, I can't get his name right, George Floyd, pre and post. So I'm going to talk about these two events and how they've affected philanthropy. The first, how has COVID affected leadership and the movement of leaders in the foundation sector? During the height of COVID, generational transfer of leadership was put on hold. Senior leaders who had planned to retire were persuaded out of a sense of obligation to stay in place and help their organizations get through the crisis, despite being ill-equipped to manage the new technology that the pandemic required. Rising stars like deputy leaders who were in the process of moving on and taking more senior roles at other organizations felt the shared commitment to remain in place at their organizations to ensure stability. Once, however, COVID began to subside in substantial ways, senior leaders retired en masse, some with great relief. And rising stars moved quickly to fill those roles, resulting in a lot of sudden change and activity in the sector, a lot of movement, a lot of change in leadership, resulting in younger leadership, which brought about the following changes in a new, younger, post-COVID generation. The newer generation is less patient, they're more action-oriented, they're more relational, they're more involved, they seek open partnerships, even while reconciling hybrid schedules. There is more direct engagement with grantee partners to build and nurture relationships. In philanthropy, a lot of foundations, traditional foundations, spend a lot of time putting together books and of descriptions of particular grants for the boards to look at, for the boards to approve. And often a program officer spends lots of time doing this rather than being out in the field learning from partner organizations. So the newer generation kind of streamlining the grant making process. They're less interested in paper, less interested in proposals. They want relationships. They want to nurture relationships. They want to be part of the action and play a key role. So they are removing structures and breaking down the power barriers that traditionally have isolated foundations from the community. They have a greater commitment to equity, and they really know what that means, and they try to do that on many different levels. They take advantage of opportunities to learn about unmet opportunities for unmet opportunities and needs, unmet needs, excuse me, for grantees. They have more transparent conversations. They want to know what the problems are for grantees. Even if grantees can't meet their set objectives, if they have open conversations about why that's the case, the new funders, the newer generation wants to know why and wants to partner with them and not penalize them for not meeting their targets, which often can be very, very difficult. They want to look under the rocks and really understand what's going on, kind of rolling up their sleeves. So this newer generation, the changes in philanthropy, prioritize conversations with board, with families, if it's a family foundation, with grantee partners, with community members, all to build relations to inspire collective learning and greater impact. It also goes beyond foundation staff to include boards in this learning journey of community needs. It can lead boards to engage community members in their foundation decision making, either on their boards or if they create advisory boards. The newer generation seeks to make the relationship between the grantor and the grantee more equitable, respecting the different tools that each brings to the table as partners, not just subjecting to the partner who has the money, has all the power, but rather the partner who has the capital, the working capital to make a difference in the community also is of equal importance. So what does this mean in terms of retention? Well, you find that newer executives have a shorter attention span, a shorter retention. So while typically in the foundation world in particular, where the jobs tend to be really attractive, you'll get executives who stay in their position for 7 and 10 years and longer. The newer generation is like 3 or 5 years. They're not wedded to institution. They're wedded to ideas and thoughts and power and concepts and change. So often they move around, which is interesting because it makes them usually have multi-sector experience, and multi-sector experience where you can bring the tenants of the different sectors together to create a strong organization can be really a powerful contributor to philanthropy. So now turning to the other trend of how the murder of George Floyd affected philanthropy. So following the murder of George Floyd, there was a racial reckoning. Lots of discussions, conversations, lots of examination as to where we are as a country. Most foundations were inspired and compelled to take action. Most made statements condemning racism with vows for anti-racist action. Some provided unconscious bias training for their staff and board. Some invited grantee partners to address the board on issues and help with training. Some hired consultants to conduct DEI audits of the organization to learn where the gaps are and the potential courses of action. Some immediately looked to diversifying their staff. Some looked to diversifying their boards. Some looked to prioritizing and even restricting funding to organizations based on their leadership of color on the executive and board levels, looking at that leadership to determine how much grants, how much support they would give an organization. Some even looked further at diversifying the vendors of the organization to employ equity at all different levels. There was lots of activity. Not just on a professional level, but also personal conversations were happening. I received calls out of the blue from people I hadn't heard from in years. Wow, Paul, I didn't know it was that bad. Have you been stopped by the police? Well, yeah, several times, in fact, yeah. So it was an opportunity for deeper discussions on this matter. But the outcome as it relates to change in employment has been very mixed. The outcome's been very varied. Foundations have engaged in different approaches, some with success and many without success. There was a surge to advance equity in the immediate aftermath of the murder, but much of the effort was rushed and not thoughtful. Many foundations ran into roadblocks. Some so much that the foundation industry today is back to where it was pre-Floyd status. The needle has not moved much at all. Some of the strategies were, let's hire a chief diversity officer. Well, the intent was good, but the backup And the idea and the setup often was weak. Sometimes the chief diversity officer didn't even report to the CEO, didn't even have any connection to the CEO. What we've all learned in terms of promoting diversity is that the chief diversity officer should be the CEO, not an additional person. It should be the priority of the CEO and the board director. And when it comes from the top, it can be much more effective. Some said, let's hurry up, let's hire a leader of color. We need to do that. We haven't had one ever, so let's hurry up and do it. And you can do that, but if you don't offer the appropriate support, the person's not likely to succeed. It's just like when women were first hired to head organizations. If they didn't receive support, some of them didn't succeed and they were overly scrutinized. And the same thing can happen here. And what I have found is that for leaders, first-time leaders of color, but leaders in general, to succeed, you need a mentor on the board, you need a mentor in the field, you need an executive coach. Many have executive coaches that can be helpful. You need to be told about what your gaps are. For example, when we interview candidates, let's say there are 10 buckets. Nobody fills all the 10 buckets. Somebody might fill 6 or 7, but there are 3 or 4 concerns because nobody's perfect. Well, if the candidates know about those concerns in advance, they can start preparing, taking classes, learning from others, which is really important. But the key thing here, and this is for all of us, the key thing here is when you lead, you have to be able to fail forward. You have to be able to take risks. If you're going to make a difference, you've got to take risks, right? So if you have a leader who takes on 4 new initiatives and 1 fails, well, that happens. And in philanthropy, it happens a lot because philanthropy is about taking risks on different organizations. But if you hire somebody and you're culturally aligned, you share a culture with them, and that person takes a risk and fails, you're like, oh, I could see myself doing that. There's no problem. Give the person a break. Of course, they're going to make mistakes, and let's move on. It's a learning opportunity. But if you take a risk to hire somebody that you don't culturally connect with, and you feel like you really took a leap to hire this person, and that person makes a mistake, often the response is, you see, I shouldn't have hired that person. That's not going to work. And often that person gets fired. And that's like one of the problems with not handling diversity in kind of in a thoughtful way. So I wanted to say. The other thing I wanted to say with regard to governance, I know some of you are involved on boards, or certainly advisory boards are involved, and boards are incredibly important. And my take is that there are 2 things that are really important in philanthropy, but in general as well. And that is, a board needs to be self-aware. It needs to know itself. And what I mean by that is, certainly in hiring, a board needs to know what its priorities are, what its values are. They need to be able to communicate that to a search firm and to candidates, so candidates can have a clear sense. The problem is that a lot of times boards think they're A, but they're really B. And what I mean by that is, when you think of organizations, you always want to think of an organization that's about change, it's about action, it's about making a difference, et cetera. And so it's really key for the boards to understand whether they're a board that wants to continue the same way and with some modest improvements, or whether there's a board that they're open to change, open to different thinking, et cetera. So a lot of boards tend to think that they're open to change and open to different thinking. And they want to think about that because that sounds exciting. The problem is, sometimes when a board thinks that way, they emotionally are in a different place. So they may hire somebody who's a change agent because they're thinking that they really want change. And when they hire that person, and that person suddenly starts taking actions, they say, wait a minute, we didn't buy this, we're not ready. So there's an intellectual disconnect in terms of what they think they want and what they're emotionally ready for. Because a lot of times people emotionally want to kind of stay where they are. And that's one thing that's really important for boards, just to be very self-aware. And it's fine if a board doesn't want to undergo a lot of change, that's fine. Just communicate that and be clear about that, which is important. The other thing I would say about boards, which is important, especially as it relates to philanthropy, is that if it's a board that's affecting change in a community that they're not from, et cetera, then it's important to listen to community voices and to have them involved in some way. Some foundations, even family foundations, will include community members on their board. Some, if the bylaws are such for a family foundation that it's only limited to family, they'll have an advisory board. The important thing here, though, is not to fund at people, but to fund with people and listen to their voices and understand what they need. And that should drive how you can fund and how you can fund effectively. So the last thing I would say, and thanks for listening here, and I hope I've inspired some questions or some thoughts, is that the concepts I think today in philanthropy that are really important for leaders. I'm just going to give you some thoughts, some words that I think are really important. Adaptability. Somebody who can adapt to change. We had COVID, we had George Floyd, we've got wars around the world. Somebody who can adapt to that and not work in isolation. Somebody who can be flexible in their thinking and in their understanding, which relates to adaptability. Somebody who can be community responsive, who values the community, who has an earnest connection, who can listen to community members, who respects them and works with them and partnering them. That's really important. Somebody is a connector. In philanthropy, you're connecting ideas, thoughts, peoples, institutions, and you've got to be excited and inspired by bringing people together. Clearly, humility is important. And that's the ability to think about the perspective of others and not to be driven by ego, but to listen carefully and to work with others and to know that you alone don't have the answers. The other thing that I think is really important, and this gets to kind of COVID and the George Floyd matter, and it gets to certainly DEI matters, is intentionality. To sit back and to think about how effective we can be and to take the steps rather than rushing into things, rushing into hiring somebody without giving thought as to how you can support them. It's important to really be intentional on all levels, even when you're investing in projects and in nonprofit organizations, to be intentional about how you can support, to be intentional about being flexible, to be intentional about listening and working with the partner and understanding them and working as the newer generation is certainly doing. And the last thing I would say is the ability and the support and confidence to fail forward. That's so important. So here, if I were recruiting, let's say somebody in the audience was interested in working at a foundation or serving on the board, and let's say it's a foundation that's community oriented, these are the questions I would ask. I would ask them, do you believe in philanthropy as a catalyst to facilitate community engagement and change? So I'd love to hear your kind of theory on philanthropy, how effective you think philanthropy can be and how it can be used. Then I would ask, are you dedicated to empowering communities to grow, thrive, and realize their own aspirations? So that gets to the importance of community and also to listening to them and listening to their aspirations and responding to their aspirations. Then I would ask, do you value voices from the community and can you build effective community partnerships, which is related to the question I just asked? And then I would ask, are you a natural convener, energized by the power of collective learning, excuse me. Are you a natural convener, energized by the power of collective learning? Here is at a foundation, but also in nonprofits, you have the ability to bring people together, to bring the best minds together, to work together and to learn from each other. If you're working with a family foundation, et cetera, it's to encourage learning within the family and to learn with the family and to be able to articulate the family's needs. But learning is really key. We should always be learning. And then the last question is, would you find connecting people, resources, and innovative ideas for the greater good, which is I asked. So if you can answer all those questions in a satisfactory way, and those questions inspire and appeal to you, I would say, let's sign up. Let's make a difference. Let's make a difference through philanthropy. So those are my remarks. I hope they stimulated some thoughts, and I'm open to answer any questions that people may have. If you have any, I hope so. Yes, please.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That was great. So you spoke a lot about the younger generation and how they like to engage. You spoke a lot about governance and engaging the community. It seems to me you're talking about trust-based philanthropy, right?
Mhm.
Do you think that foundations will actually move more in that direction?
Mhm.
Because I feel like from what I'm seeing during the pandemic, there was a bit of let's go with that approach. And now many large foundations are sort of back to the sort of the more metrics driven approach. So I just wonder what your take is on that.
So I think it's a good point about moving forward and going backwards. I think that in those foundations that took a few steps forward and kind of are moving back now, those probably still have the same established leaders. But organizations that have changed in leadership and are having younger leaders take over, I do think that they are truly interested in engagement and truly interested in what you call trust-based philanthropy, where you trust the grantee. You're working on this together as a project. You can have an open relationship. You can talk about problems. If the grantee's having problems, they're not going to be penalized for those problems. But it's those. So I do think there are some changes, but it's really interesting because the whole thing with George Floyd too is that there really was little movement, and now it's regressing. So that can happen. But I have hope, and I know of new leaders that I've placed from the firm where I work that are making a difference. So we just have to continue to hope.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Yes. Yes.
Thanks. Thanks
Okay.
so much, Paul. So you spoke about boards and staff and advisory boards and things, and these are positions and people. How, in terms of scope and scale, like how big? What's the, sort of the range and size of boards that you typically see or might see across the strata, and sort of numbers of staff, and when people have advisory boards, sort of how many people might be on those entities?
So for advisory boards, um, the, my experience with advisory boards is that where family foundations are kind of limited to just having family members involved based on their bylaws and their governance, they often will have advisory boards. And the family foundation board can vary in size. I mean, it can vary in size, just like 5 people to 10 or 15. It can be generations. I've worked with one foundation that has like 3 generations of board members, and they have what they call a membership, which is a broader organization. So it really varies. As you know, no foundations are alike. Everyone's different. But I think that the reason why I think advisory boards can be important is that if you really want to ensure that you get community voices, if you really want to ensure that you get input, it's important to have people outside of the board, especially if it's a family outside of the board, come and speak. So that's what I've seen. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Any other questions? No. Going once. Going twice. Yeah. Oh yes. Go ahead.
What I know, when I was on the search committee for an organization and we hired you 10, 12 years ago, the question I think members of the search committee always ask us, how long is the process going to take from the minute you're engaged till we get our CEO on premise? And I know at that time I thought I knew everything about foundations and how, and you really educated us as a member of the search committee. Can you just maybe spend a couple minutes talk about the process?
So here, I think, again, what I was trying to say in my remarks earlier about being thoughtful and about being intentional. I mean, you can go ahead and hire someone quickly, right? But unless you really know what the board wants, and unless the board has empowered a search committee to really investigate and really understand where they are and where they're going, what needs that they have, et cetera, unless you take the time to do that, you can hire improperly. So in our process, we have this first phase, which we call due diligence. And as a search consultant, what I do is I speak with every board member individually. I speak with the search committee, which usually is a subset of the board, individually, to learn about how they think about the culture of the organization, how they think about its strengths, its weaknesses, and its needs. And the reason why it's so important to speak with everybody individually is that people differ in their thinking. and I want to find out kind of what makes sense. What are the commonalities? If there are any differences or tensions, what are they, so we can work them out, so we can have an understanding. So there's that first part of really just trying to understand the culture of the organization. I'm one of these guys who feels that clearly hard skills are important. You need somebody who can manage, who understands budgets and everything. But I tend to think, like with foundations in particular and organizations, the cultural fit, the alignment of values is absolutely critical. So when I speak with people, I want to get what drives them, what moves them, why are they so involved, what kind of passion do they have for their mission and for their organization, and that really helps. So in the first phase, that's kind of what we focus on. In the second phase, I will come up with profiles. I'll be speaking with people, and I come up with profiles to share with the committee. What I always do, and one of the things I think is critical in search, but just in general, is I will present a couple of outliers. You know, if they say they want somebody who's worked in philanthropy and they want somebody who's worked in family philanthropy, et cetera, you know, certainly we'll get profiles like that, but we'll get somebody completely outside of philanthropy. It could be interesting. Maybe not even in the nonprofit sector, in the corporate sector, et cetera. And sometimes those people can offer a fresh perspective and interesting ideas. They can be really innovative. So we make a point of hiring kind of a diverse, of showing them a diverse set of people. Then after that, we help them make a decision as to who they want to interview. And of course, we help design interview questions and thoughts to really bring out the best in candidates. What we want to do is we want to make certain that candidates present themselves in the best way, and that you all, the organizations, present themselves in the best way. So I'm involved with kind of educating both, making certain that all questions are answered. This process leading to interviews and to the ultimate hiring of a candidate usually takes, if it's for a CEO, about 5 to 6 months for us to do it well. For less senior positions that are internal, maybe it's just 3 to 4 months. But we really want to make sure we get it right, because remember, one of the things I said in my talk is that a board needs to know itself. A board needs to understand where they are, what their needs are, and there needs to be unison thinking about that. That's so key, because the searches that we've done that haven't been successful, it's when there's real division on the board, or a lack of understanding of what they want, or a lack of understanding of decision-making power, like who decides, who gets hired, et cetera. So that's really important. So can I answer your question? Okay.
Yes, it does.
Well, thank you.
It does.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you,
If you
Paul.
have any questions, I'm available later, so we can talk to you. Okay. Great.
Thank you, Counselor. We're going to ask Scott Brown to fill in for Joe Ali and be our moderator here on the cyber arena. So Joe's shoes are hard to fill, Scott, so I'm just going to warn you now. Kelly, I just have to give Tom DeMayo a little whatever here. If anybody knows Tom DeMayo and they've ever looked at his business card, I'm going to read a few of the designations after them, all right? And most of us here that are accountants might say CPA, and that's it, right? Or maybe CFE, Certified Fraud Examiner. But there's 8 designations after Tom's card, and I just want to read a few of the 8. CISA, what's that, Tom? Certified Information System Auditor. CIPP, CHFI, CCFE, what's that? Certified Computer Forensic Examiner. CISSP, CEH, that one I know, Certified Ethical Hacker. I mean, you wouldn't believe there's such a thing. And there's a couple more. Somebody once told me, one of our clients, they were looking to hire a controller or a CFO, and there was so many designations after this person. They said the person is all Jeffrey, academic, and maybe they don't have some real life experience. But Tom DeMayo is the man. He's our go-to person. We see him out there. He's very requested. He's constantly busy. Cyber is such a hot topic out there. Him and Kelly are going to go hand in hand, talk about the insurance aspect of that. Scott, you're going to try and fill in for Joe here and moderate that. Do your best. All right. That's all we can ask you, Scott. Just try and do your best. Christine, where's Christine? Thought I saw her before, Christine Spellman. Oh, there you are. You were complimenting Scott before. He deserves compliments. So, folks, want to come on up?
All right, so good morning, everybody. Maybe one of these discussions will have a positive outcome with cyber, right? We'll go in the positive direction. Stats aside, and I always take these stats with a grain of salt. Depends on who publishes them, sample that they use. But one thing is consistent. That the problem continues to get worse year over year. When we look at the evolution, they get more sophisticated, right? Which means that we have to adapt, that we have to kind of stay on top of it. And part of staying on top of it is knowing how the attackers are in fact evolving. And this is where, when we look at this year, artificial intelligence, right, is a big thing. How are the attackers leveraging that? What does a foundation need to consider, or any business in general? How are they getting access? All these different things. Looking at these stats, the one that I think is really of significance is that 84% of these breaches, they still target the individual. They target the person. Technology aside, and all these things that we're putting into play, it's the person that becomes one of the weakest links. And, when you look at a lot of private foundations, and the architecture, a lot are remote, a lot are maybe in the office 2-3 days a week, so that perimeter that was once important, not as important, right? Because all the employees are dispersed, right, working in different locations. Servers, a lot don't have servers anymore. A lot are very much cloud centric. All right, which means that the infrastructure that was once maybe a little bit more porous and a little bit more vulnerable, not as much, but the person remains the weak link, right? That the endpoints become the conduit to the cloud and all those different things that you're trying to protect. Now, again, just high level stuff. When it comes to data breaches, yeah, the United States is by far, the one that has the highest amounts, followed by the Middle East, Canada, Germany, Japan, and there could be ones that are worse out there, but maybe they don't report. All right, but the U.S. remains a prime target, and this is where the money is driven. Industries, well, industries ebb and flow. You're typically not going to see a private foundation classification within here, but you are going to have things like education and maybe areas that you support, right, as part of your mission. And that's where, when you think about some of your risk, sure, there's always the attacker, but there's also third-party risk. And that's where maybe the risk of the grantees to you, because that's where some of it is going to lie. Kelly?
There we go. Making sure. Yeah, and just this is really just to sort of illustrate the legal and regulatory environment around data privacy and cybersecurity, network security. There's been a ton of activity from a regulatory standpoint recently, certainly in the US. Obviously, I think the GDPR back in 2018 really sort of spurred all this fun that we've had here in the US recently. The most recent, just to illustrate the focus on transparency, the focus on really protecting networks and network security. You see the SEC coming out with some new cybersecurity disclosure rules for public companies. We've seen 11 US states now with passing comprehensive privacy regs very similar to the GDPR. California obviously was the first, but we've seen a number of other states that have passed these regs recently, getting ready for enforcement. We have a lot of focus on biometric privacy. We've seen a lot of technology in the biometric space recently, accelerating offices utilizing things like Windows Hello and different types of biometric-based technologies. So the states are really focusing on regulating that because obviously, if somebody loses or steals your password or your credit card information, you can change that, right? You can't change your retinal scan, right? You can't change your fingerprint. So it's really very sensitive information, right? So we need to protect it. So the states are focusing on that. And to Tom's point about artificial intelligence, I think ChatGPT was launched, just about a year ago. Within about a week, you had 1 million users. So artificial intelligence has become obviously a focus of regulation. I think that China has passed some regulation already. And I think obviously the EU AI Act is probably poised to be the first real comprehensive regulation. I think it's expected to go live in 2024, maybe. But you see a lot of state regs. It's really a patchwork. New York has some regulation around discrimination, algorithms that discriminate, right, from an AI perspective, and I think California does as well. So that's just to sort of set the stage for the regulatory atmosphere around this risk.
Yeah. And I think, touching on the SEC, I mean, obviously, private foundations are regulated by the SEC. You're not publicly registered companies, you're not broker dealers, you work with them, right, as part of your investments. But, I think the key message coming from the SEC, one of the key provisions there, is that they're making it clear that the board has a role when it comes to cybersecurity. And sure, it's targeted towards publicly registered companies, but that message carries across every organization, inclusive of private foundations, right? The board has a role that they have to play, right? As part of their fiduciary responsibility to help manage that cyber risk, which to a foundation, maybe there's not a lot of data risk, right? That of your employees, sure, but you're going to have a lot of money, right? Your investments, your reputation. These are all things that, are very important, that the board has visibility into how that is being protected, right? And the role that they have to play. And I think for a lot of the private foundations, the board has really adopted and embraced what that role is, right? And asking the questions. And that's where we do our assessments and we present, because they want to know, right? And I think the message is coming across loud and clear. Now, thinking about your attack sources, and look, these are fairly consistent, right? But, looking at last year and kind of how things were progressing, a lot of the attacks are still based around credentials, right? It sounds silly, right? The username and password just doesn't want to go away. Sure, there's movements and there's that attempt to try to get away from passwords, but that's not going to happen anytime soon, right? It's so fundamentally ingrained into so many of the technologies that maybe one day, but certainly not within the near future. So until then, managing that risk and embracing things like multi-factor and not using the same passwords, all those things that seem basic are critical. And while they seem basic, the statistics show that people just still don't follow best practices. So every year remains a focal point or a method that they're going to use because it's easy, right? Why reinvent the wheel if I can just get your password and get into your system, right? I don't need to do more if I'm the attacker. Social engineering, right? Phishing. I mentioned before, as a foundation, phishing is going to be one of those big areas of concern for you, whether it's to manipulate you to get money out the door from the investments or from your operating accounts, or to get malware into the environment so that they can pivot and move and get to the data that they potentially want. And then, of course, exploiting vulnerabilities, right? So patches or things that are known to be flawed. Last year alone, I'm sure you saw it in the headlines, but there was that Move It vulnerability, right? That dominated the headlines for a few months because it was so devastating to some of the largest organizations in the world that have a lot of money for cybersecurity budgets, but because there was this vulnerability that was so rapidly exploited by the attackers, they couldn't even respond in time, right? which just goes to show, how important even just basics like hygiene and patching really is to your cybersecurity program. And right, something that you as a foundation are going to want to make sure that is happening internally. It ebbs and flows. They're opportunistic. 2019, 2020, depending on what is exactly happening, the techniques are going to evolve. They're always looking for that opportunity. Some things become more successful because of certain things and circumstances. Like for phishing, social engineering was incredibly popular during the pandemic. Why? Because they had something that was able to hook into a lot of people and had everyone's attention. Right? No different than like with Israel. That becomes a point where, yes, you're going to see a spike in social engineering and phishing because it's something that they could hook into your emotions to get you to respond. Social engineering, right? We have our categories, a lot of ishing, right? Phishing, smishing, vishing, quishing, all right? Quishing is the newest, right? That's that QR code, right? That's where now even in emails and things like that, you're starting to see that a little bit more. But this is where, look, attacks evolve. And this is where making sure that employees understand that, yes, QR codes are in fact dangerous, right? As a matter of fact, that QR code that you scanned out front
was a trick.
is a test. Business email compromise remains predictable, all right? This is where they get into somebody's email and use that to target you, right? A lot of times it comes from your vendors, we see that, and a lot of times it comes from your grantees. We also see that as well, where money does get diverted. And it's not because you don't have policies. You do, it's just that sometimes they're not followed, right? So having the policies enforcing are going to remain key. And it keeps going up, right, every year. Ransomware, can't get away from that, right? Still remains a very dominant, prominent threat in the environment. And a lot of the ways that happens is through business email compromise or through phishing. That becomes the entry point into the environment. And then there's third-party risk, all right? You as a foundation, because you are in fact so cloud-based, you rely on a lot of other parties to facilitate, whether it's the custodians, whether it's the managed service providers that you're using, or the Foundants, the Flux, all these applications that you use that are third party. All right, third party risk is going to be important. That's where your due diligence and the monitoring of them is going to remain critical. On the attack evolution, well, MFA, right? Important. Yes, you have to have it, but guess what? 2-3 years ago, they weren't actively involved with trying to bypass MFA because, well, they didn't have to, right? A lot of people still didn't have it. Well, that's changed, right? Especially with cyber insurance, almost mandating. If you want a policy, well, remote access, you better have MFA, right? Otherwise, you're probably not going to get coverage. But they had to adapt, right? So now, because all of you have MFA, well, now they actively bypass it, right? On a common, day-to-day basis, right? And even us as pen testers, we've evolved where we're going to bypass it.
I was just going to add to the insurance piece. So from 2020 to 2022, the cyber insurance market was just crazy, right? And MFA was one of the ways they were trying to sort of lock things down. And they were mandating it. If you didn't have MFA across the board, you essentially couldn't get a quote for cyber insurance. And now that's even relaxed because they've recognized that this is not, it's not the sort of brick wall that they thought it might be, and really prevent. I mean, it helps obviously, but it just had to get the cyber criminals' attention, and now they just becomes a bit of a game for them to try to focus.
For some of the people
Oh, that's him, yeah.
That would be multi-factor authentication, right? So that's that little text message you get. That's that little app that you have with the rotating numbers, right? That's multi-factor. Right? So the mechanisms they use, MFA fatigue, they keep trying to get you in. Hopefully you hit approve, right? You get frustrated. SIM swap, they go after the cell phones, right? They try to port your number over, impersonate you, social engineer the phone companies, get that number. Well, now they get their text messages. I want to say over the past 3 months, I probably worked through about 5 million of losses as a result of a SIM swap, right? Because the business owners that were targeted didn't have a lot of the other controls in play. And sure enough, money was lost, right? It was very, very rapid how quickly, once the attackers launched, they got in and they moved the money, okay? More common is this session hijacking, right? This is where they're going to get between you and the third party. They're going to proxy, all right? If I sit between you and your custodial bank where you have multi-factor authentication, I'm going to trick you to come to me. You're going to think it's a custodial bank. You're going to pretty much interface with me. I'm going to relay everything off to the bank, okay? Bank's going to say it looks good. It's going to let you in, all right? You're going to be none the wiser because you will be in your account. You're not going to know that I was in the middle, but I would have stolen your session, which means that I don't need your multi-factor because I have your session, all right? Which means that I'm in your account, okay? That is effectively how they're going to bypass. But in order for that to work, as technical as that is, there was one key thing. I had to get you to the wrong page, all right? Which means I had to socially engineer you, which goes back to the basics, right? Yes, they're sophisticated, and that is an incredibly sophisticated attack with how it works, but it relies and all hinges on the person doing something that they shouldn't, right? By not paying attention. And that goes back to the getting you to the wrong page, okay? Kelly?
So artificial intelligence, I mean, we could probably do an entire day on artificial intelligence and the different, the goods and the bads, right? I mean, artificial intelligence obviously can be utilized to really improve efficiency, improve productivity, all sorts of great things, and it will do great things. But the general areas of concern and the things that the insurance market is really focused on, worried about, are the accuracy, the hallucinations. I think we've all heard a little bit about that. They're not always right. So ChatGPT does often produce inaccurate responses. Bias, and that's what has generated a number of the regs in the US around algorithms that were biased at the outset. We see that in the HR setting, right? When they're scanning applications, if the algorithm is set up to be biased, then the applications that are scanned are going to be potentially discriminated against, right? So, so there are some regs coming out around that. Obviously, data privacy and confidentiality. You know, the different AI models or generative AI models that are out there, like ChatGPT, and some of the other ones are sort of public in nature. I know there are some that are, you know, they're starting to focus on more private ones, but if you think about just ChatGPT in general, anything you put in there that is confidential information is open to the public, essentially. So you could be violating various data protection laws or confidentiality provisions in different contracts. Network security. Artificial intelligence is being used by the bad guys. They are utilizing it to improve their efficiency and productivity, and you know, the financial piece of their scams. So it is being used. Intellectual property. There are various you know, lawsuits out there right now around you know, kind of infringement, copyright infringement, patent infringement, arising out of the use of generative AI. So it makes things up. I don't know if anyone heard about the lawsuit involving the lawyers. This was back in June, I think, and I can't remember the name of the lawsuit, but it was a personal injury lawsuit against an airline, and two lawyers, very experienced lawyers, 30 years practicing, used ChatGPT to draft the brief. And in the brief, there were 8 or 9 cases that were cited that supported their position. And when the other side went to sort of shepherdize those cases and make sure, you know, sort of look at them and try to figure out how to defend against them, they were like, can't find these anywhere. And they went to the judge and said, hey, so we can't find these. And the lawyers, again, stood their ground. They went to ChatGPT and said, are these cases real? And they were like, yes. ChatGPT came back and said, yes. And so they went back to the judge and said, yes, these are real. They were not. And so that, you know, it does hallucinate because it's based on, and I'm sure Tom can explain it better than I can, but it's large amounts of data, right? And it's public data. So if you put in bad data, you're going to get bad data out. So it does hallucinate. It isn't always effective.
And with the hallucinations, it's again one of these anomalies where even if they know the facts, for some reason it doesn't say the facts. Right? There was a simple example. They were going with Bing Chat, which is another AI component. And they were asking you what the year was. It was insistent it was 2022. Well, no, it's 2023, right? That's a hallucination, right? The facts are there, just for whatever reason, it just starts regurgitating nonsense, right? Non-factual information, which, as a foundation, in any business, you have to start thinking about the role AI is going to play, whether you're going to put a policy or the point Kelly made to me the other day, you're going to take a position, all right? You want to do something because it is going to have a place. The question is what place and how you're going to control it, right? And those are the things you want to start thinking about. And yes, on the cyber side, it's going to make things probably get worse, all right? Because they are getting sophisticated, and then it's going to be AI against AI, right? They're going to use AI to attack, which means that we're going to need AI to defend, right? As well as a human element. Especially when it comes to social engineering. I wouldn't be surprised if you see a lot more dollar losses and things like that as a result of artificial intelligence, because what does it do in that realm? Well, one, it helps write the emails, okay? So all that grammar and all that stuff goes away. And two, it helps with impersonation. So that's your deep fake. That's where that video that you see on the screen, right, or that person you see on the screen might not exactly be that person, right? Or that voice that you hear that you become accustomed to trust, it might not be that person, right? Because it's trained to emulate that person's voice, which as executives or board members, where you might have a more, presence and you're out there, well, they could use that to train the algorithms to now call your controller or your CFO to say, hey, transfer these funds. Okay. And those are things that, again, as you evolve, you're going to want to think about.
Tom, I have a quick example of that. So we had a client that where that exact kind of scenario played out. It was a voice message that was left. So there was an email. There was an email from the individual at the firm saying, "Hey, just confirm this is correct for me." And the voice message was left for her that said, "I'm traveling today. I'll be, I won't be able to talk to you personally, but take it, it definitely is correct. We've made a change." And the voice was exactly the same, according to this individual. And so she transferred money.
And this is going to evolve, right? This is going to be your next wave, okay? Just like you have ChatGPT or you have Fraud GPT, right? The same engine used in ChatGPT, same model, but now it's producing malware, it's producing the phishing pages. It's going to take the barrier of entry for a hacker and now drop it even lower, all right? Where you can simply ask and it produces, right? You don't need to know how to code and do that type of stuff. And yes, it's a service model, right? You pay for the months that you want to use it. They promise that it's privacy focused, right? So that's a good thing, right? When you're using this. And the more you use, right, the less you pay, right? Full-fledged commercial model. Now transferring the risk, right? This is where Kelly kind of really comes into play.
Cyber insurance. So cyber insurance, just to sort of set the stage here, a lot of people think that cyber insurance should capture all of that if I transfer the money kind of risk, right? Replace the money. And it does. There are elements of it. But really, it's intended, a cyber insurance policy is intended to protect against the loss and theft of data. They do have provisions within the cyber insurance policy that will apply to financial loss. So if you are social engineered to transfer $100,000 away, you may have a sublimit of coverage on the cyber insurance policy that will capture that. But the full limit is typically not available for the financial loss, because the cyber policy is intended for data. The cyber insurance market today is pretty good, actually. Cyber insurance is still a relatively immature insurance product in the grand scheme of things. It sort of popped onto the stage around in the late 1990s, early 2000s, but as we know it today, it really has only been around maybe for about 15 years, the way that we know the product today. And up until 2020, when the pandemic hit, really, the market was great. I mean, the underwriting was a bit of a joke. You could get a quote for cyber insurance based off of very minimal information. And 2020 hit, we saw a significant increase in the frequency and severity of ransomware attacks in particular. but cybercrime across the board. And as a result, the markets really sort of changed their philosophy. And they got really, really serious, and underwriting became very, very technical. And now the tables has sort of it's slowed down a bit. So there's healthy competition in the cyber insurance market today. Rates are pretty stable. We are seeing flat renewals. We are seeing some decreases in premium on cyber insurance. Capacity is strong. During that 2020 to 2022 period of time, you couldn't really get a primary insurance limit of more than 5 million. They were very, very hesitant to put up a lot of money, the insurance carriers, but today it's back up to 10. There are, the technical underwriting, I don't think will ever go away. I think the technical underwriting is here to stay. I think it's the only way to ensure that cyber insurance remains a viable risk transfer mechanism for people. So the technical underwriting is there. It does, depending on the risk, depending on the industry, there's long question, a lot of detailed questions, a lot of technical questions. And I think that's here to stay. We are seeing biometric exclusions, as I talked about before in the regulatory space. There are some exclusions going on to these cyber insurance policies arising out of claims based on biometric, the collection of biometric data. They're very concerned about that. And we are starting to see some questions around cloud-based resources, questions around if you are using, we are seeing more attacks on cloud-based providers. And that kind of an attack would be quite systemic for the industry, the cyber insurance industry. So they are starting to get pretty concerned about that. And I suspect artificial intelligence is spurring that a bit, and allowing these cyber criminals to really kind of go a little bit deeper and be more sophisticated in that regard. Also seeing a lot of questions around generative artificial intelligence, as Tom mentioned before. Insurance carriers are looking to understand whether or not you have a policy about whether your employees or you can use generative AI in a business context, or if you've taken a position on it. If you have a policy in place, how are you enforcing it? How are you updating it? This is, artificial intelligence is evolving, and all the technology really is evolving at such a rapid rate. Typical policies that you might put in place, you could put in place on January 1st of 2024 and then review it in, January 1st of 2025. You can't really do that with artificial intelligence. You've got to stay on top of it. Carriers are also looking to know what your board is doing. Is your board involved? Are you conducting training? What are your trainings looking like? Because I think, to Tom's point, at the end of the day, I think what the insurance carriers are starting to realize is that it all comes down to, you can have the best cybersecurity, network security defenses in place, but at the end of the day, it's all traces back to a person that clicks on a link. Or makes a decision, right, to do something, to transfer money. So it really has to do more about, are you training people in the organization? How frequently are you doing that? Is it up to date? Like, is it the quishing, right? Like, make sure that you have up to date trainings that are based on the threats that exist today. And that's super important. The other thing that cyber insurance carriers are looking for is tabletop exercises. They want to see that you are doing the fire drill, right? That you are going through it, that you know what's going to happen. Because I can tell you right now, I have a very large client that experienced a ransomware attack overnight. Very sophisticated chief risk officer, very smart. And she's just like, I just want to pay the ransom. So like an hour ago, she said that to me, and I said, "Well, let's just find out what's going on before we." But it's a true crisis event, and I think unless you do these tabletop exercises on some sort of regular basis, and you have these discussions about whether or not you're going to pay a ransom and under what circumstances, it's very easy to make very rash decisions in those kind of scenarios. what else do I have here? They are sort of relaxing some of the requirements that they had put in place, like the MFA requirement. The cyber insurance or insurance carriers are getting a little bit more relaxed about that these days. But as a general proposition, it's a good place to be today if you're trying to buy cyber insurance.
And Kelly kind of mentioned the premiums skyrocketed for a period, kind of came down, right? So now they're kind of leveling off, you would say?
Yeah.
And also too, you know, they're starting some of what you see, and depending on who's actually doing the underwriting, who the carrier is, but they are looking to have some skin in the game for you, right? Especially around the patching. You know, and that goes back to making sure that you're timely. Where look, if you don't patch necessarily within a certain time, and that was out there, and you had the ability to do it, but you didn't do it, well, maybe they're not going to cover the full amount. All right. So again, it's all kind of bleeding in, and what they expect and what they want, and they expect you to be healthy, right, and to have the correct controls in place. No different than a life insurance policy. And then before we move into questions and answers, I mean, look, there is a solution, right? But you got to have the program in play, and you got to stay on top of the program. All right. And I think a lot of you have embraced that this is not a one and done type thing. Right. It has to be part of your enterprise risk management, which means that you have to stay on top of it. Right. Risks evolve. Well, you got to respond. All right. Controls are in place where you got to make sure the controls are happening the way they should. All right. People are accountable. Right. That's why we have financial audits and we have all these other things. But you want your competency and your capabilities in these 5, what I would say, pillars. Right. You have to identify the threats. You have to protect against them once you identify them. If you can't protect it, well, then look, you better detect it. If you detect it, well, then you have to know how to respond to it. And then once you respond to it, part of that's going to be, well, you got to recover, right? And that's resiliency, right? Hopefully, if you know, the pandemic taught us a lot, but one of it also taught us is that we have to be resilient, you know, from a business continuity, but because cybercrime rocketed during that period too, from a cyber standpoint as well. Okay.
Wasn't sure if I was going to be able to stand after hearing all of that. Oh boy. If you didn't have trouble going to sleep, I don't know. I mean, after hearing Tom and Kelly there, AI is not all that bad. I heard there's an app that if you need to update your professional photo, you can download it and take it, and it makes you look like 20 years younger. It's fantastic. My wife told me about it. I don't know if she was trying to tell me something, but yeah, she told me about that. So a couple questions. Artificial intelligence, Tom, has become such a hot topic. I mean, you can't go anywhere without hearing about it. Just in the news the other day, I think Sports Illustrated was in trouble for hiring a third-party company that actually created AI photos of writers that didn't exist and had some, articles that were completely artificially fabricated. But in terms of private foundations, what should private foundations be doing or thinking about as it relates to artificial intelligence?
Right. So, from a private foundation standpoint, and I've had discussions with a lot, right? The questions come up, well, should we have a policy? What should we put into the policy? Again, I think you have to have a policy or position, right? Something you want to somehow get ahead of it, right? And communicate so that you're not completely blind to the risk. Because part of the discussion could be, well, look, we don't know enough about it, so we're going to ban it, right? That usually doesn't resonate well because a lot of people come back, to Scott's point, there are a lot of useful applications and things that could benefit, but there's also caveats, right? And I think it's understanding those caveats, especially when it comes to the factuality, making sure people understand that. Maybe there's disclaimers, maybe that all kind of goes into the policy. And I think one of the key things too is, especially if you're going to use a commercial, an open source like a ChatGPT, and not a commercial model where, you have better control over the privacy, or there's more stringent privacy agreements between you and the vendor and how they're going to use that data. All right. They have to be cognizant that, yes, they are feeding an engine. Okay. That data, once it's exposed, is going into, a large data set, right? So you effectively expose it. At a minimum, you want to make sure that they understand that, you don't just go putting confidential, sensitive data into those engines. You want to ask a question about a fact or something like that, well, go for it, right? But if you're going to start putting information on grantees or employee personal information, well, that's a no-no, all right? So I think it's having the policy, figuring out where it's going to be used, right, or taking a position, figuring out where you're comfortable with it, making sure people understand the caveats, and also have some sort of parameters around maybe the engines that you are comfortable with, where there's certain controls that you could put into play, like ChatGPT, for example. There is an option where you could toggle off the history and the using of the data as part of the larger data set. All right, but you have to know it's there, and you have to educate people to actually leverage it.
Can I just add real quick? The other suggestion I would have, and this is again coming from insurance underwriters, is understand whether or not your vendors that you use or business partners that you use are using artificial intelligence. You need to know what they're doing too, and be able to audit that yourself and make a decision as to whether or not that impacts you from a network security standpoint, data privacy standpoint, or otherwise.
So Kelly, just to kind of follow up on that, is that how the insurance market is approaching generative artificial intelligence?
They're trying to figure it out as well, right? Right now, the only questions we're really getting are what are you do you have a policy or have you taken a position on it? But the one thing that is has started to emerge recently is the focus on third-party risk, right? And even fourth-party risk, right? So if you have a vendor that you use that then use subcontractors, how is your whole ecosystem using generative AI? Because to Tom's point before, it can be used and it should be used. We should sort of embrace it, but we have to, because it can improve efficiencies, right? And that is important. We can't ignore it, but it comes with it's still a relatively immature technology that has some bumps, right?
It's interesting. So thinking about the third party, right, putting it in perspective of the private foundations, your grantees, how are they using it, right? How are they using it to support the mission that you're embracing, right, or that you're facilitating with that? Same thing. How are they using AI potentially to report back to you the metrics and all those other things? How accurate and reliable are now those going to be, depending on what they're using to actually produce? So thinking about it from that perspective, that is something that you might want to consider as part of your grantee risk management, right, or onboarding process.
Great, thank you. So, Tom, we still encounter many private foundations that are victims of disbursement fraud. What are some key controls that they should consider?
So, every year I think it's going to get less, but then it still continues to happen. All right. And I think one, you got to have your separate approvers and initiators. That's the first thing. All right. Without question. Even if you're small, try to get a board member or somebody so that you have that second stopgap before money gets out the door, right? Someone to ask the questions to make sure it's valid. All right. You need to make sure that no matter what, and this is going to be even more important with deep fake and the cloning of voices and video, that callback procedure, doesn't matter who is asking, it has to exist, all right? Which means that your employees are going to have to be well aware that it's okay to challenge the CFO or the CEO and not do anything until you get that positive confirmation outside of whatever the message is, because if not, I can guarantee money is going to move. All right. That callback procedure is number one. And when money does move, it always goes back, the callback procedure wasn't done. All right. Or, they followed the instructions in the email or called the number in the email and didn't go back to the known good number on record. All right. It's just getting the policy, training, enforcing. And when you have those two key things, yes, there's other things you could do, but I would think those are the two key, right, to prevent that money from moving.
And from an insurance perspective, a lot of the policies will require the verification procedure. Not all of them, but a lot of them will require that. And even if they don't require it as a term of the insurance contract, they will certainly be asking that question on the insurance application. So you're going to be, in a position where you have to answer the question.
And just to kind of follow up on that, Tom, a lot of organizations, not just private foundations, but in general, starting to use third-party services, RAM, Bill.com. Does that alleviate any of that issue or sort of securities that they need, or is there even more security, and what should foundations be doing when they utilize those third-party services?
That's a good question. So
I asked
He
it.
was not ready for that.
You're supposed to tell me first, guys. So, thinking about Bill.com. So yes, things like positive pay, that's all pretty much built into the process, right? As part of what they do. But still, a lot of times you are allowing someone to enroll, right? Where you're asking them to go in, put in information. So to some extent, you have transferred a little bit of the onus, but at the same time, I would still have something in play where if numbers are being updated, I'm going to want to know, right? Because how do I know it was actually them that got into the account and updated those numbers, right? So I think the callback procedure still has to persist because you want to make sure that it was in fact them that updated, right? Especially if it's not part of the onboarding process. The onboarding process is not usually where we see the problem. It's always that change, all right? So even with those systems, I think you still got to be tuned into when those changes are occurring and validating, because no matter what, look, it's your money, right? Whether it's a third party or not, that's coming from your account, right? So you got to make sure you're following through with that.
Great. And Kelly, does cyber insurance provide coverage for cyber crime attacks resulting in loss of money, such as if one of these social engineering attacks occur?
It does, but it is limited. Again, as I sort of mentioned before, the focus of the cyber insurance policy is to protect data. If you're looking at financial loss, it's really more of a commercial crime policy. So there is overlap between those two policies. So social engineering fraud coverage does exist within the confines of a cyber insurance policy. It's usually at a relatively low sublimit, maybe 250,000. I think I've seen as high as 500,000. With proper controls. And then you may have that sitting also in a commercial crime policy. And you might be able to stack those. That's what we try to do.
So will the commercial crime policy actually cover the social engineering?
There's social engineering fraud coverage that sits. In fact, a little history story, that's where Chubb was the inventor of social engineering fraud coverage, because the commercial crime, it was happening, and the commercial crime policies didn't address it at all. And so they were starting to have to pay. There is a voluntary parting exclusion in a commercial crime policy that they were trying to use to kind of push it out. Because if you voluntarily give the money, and that's really essentially what they were arguing, is you voluntarily parted with the money because you were tricked into doing it. So they created this separate bucket of coverage and sublimated it so that they could contain the exposure. And again, it's still pretty tight in terms of the amount of limits they'll put up.
That's interesting. I didn't even know that. I don't know how many foundations of that too, because, I know there's always been a lot of discussions with private foundations and, asking me, should we get cyber insurance? Or Tom, take a look at this policy. Does it make sense? Typically, I go back and I look at what's being covered, credit card, PCI compliance. Well, one, you don't accept credit cards. Receivables, well, you don't have receivables, right? So they're throwing in all this coverage, but it doesn't equate to your risk, right? The money that you care about, well, 250. I think the most I've ever seen that get up to after back and forth was like 500,000, and that was the absolute max.
Right. So financial institutions can get more money, more limit, but there is a new product actually that's out on the market from Lloyd's that will go up to $1 million.
Yeah, and actually, a lot of foundations decided not to do it because they said, look, the policy doesn't really cover our risk. What are we paying for? Right.
Right. Because again, it's based on the cyber insurance policy is focused around data. It really evolved out of these breach notification laws that started to sweep the country in 2002, 2003. So these cyber insurance policies were initially intended to respond to the breach notification laws. So if you had a breach like Target, you had to notify 100,000 people, it would provide coverage. I remember being on the carrier side at that time, and we viewed cyber extortion coverage as like a throw-in. It was like funny, we just throw it in. That changed.
So next question we have here, ransomware. So Kelly, you kind of brought this up before about a very recent issue with ransomware, but this is a topic that shows up every day in the news. And how is it evolving? And what are the key controls foundations need to consider? So maybe that question's first to Tom. But what would you suggest in terms of controls around ransomware?
I think from the foundation standpoint and how they're going to get hit, it's going to be one, the training, right? So it's going to come to the person. Two, it's going to be control of the endpoints, right? So that's where your monitoring and your malware software, all those things have to be in play, and as well as the patching, right? Even if you still have a firewall at the perimeter, we've seen over the last year a number of those major firewall vendors have pretty significant issues where that was the entry into the environment, right? So you still want to focus on those areas. The one thing I will say, and I know this is something that, again, I still have a lot of conversations with foundations, and it's a cultural thing that some are getting past. But a lot of times, because they are so cloud centric, they don't necessarily want to force the employees to use the laptop or device they provided to access the systems, all right? Like the grants management system or whatever it might be, which, again, take a risk-based approach. But my argument always is, because a lot of you are spending a lot of money on some of this software, right? Putting in these controls, all this fancy next generation antivirus, monitoring. Well, that's great, but that's on the devices you control, right? If you're letting people use other devices, well, then all that money you spent is for naught, all right? So you really want to think about that policy and really start to think about, look, you've given them a laptop. There's no reason why they can't take that home and work when they're working from home, all right? If it's really an issue, we'll get them 2 laptops, right? Because the cost of that second laptop is going to be a lot less than the implications of a breach if it does ever occur.
And I think what always helps me think about ransomware and the importance of focusing on that is this statistic. Can anybody tell me what the average return on investment of a ransomware attack is? Just a guess.
I don't even know.
What'd you say? 1%. It's almost 2,000%. So that's the financial incentive, right, behind these attacks. They're the financial motivation is what's driving this, why you see it in the news all the time, and it's what the insurance industry is so panicky about, right? And it is, I think, the training piece of it. Like my focus when I talk to our clients is make sure that you are training, you're providing frequent training, but you're also doing those tabletop exercises, because the impact of a ransomware attack will directly be connected to how prepared you are to respond to it, right? So from a reputational standpoint, from a financial standpoint, if you are prepared, that impact will be lessened significantly, and I've seen it in practice. Yes. I'd have to check. It was back. I think it was Chubb. It was one of the insurance carriers.
So just staying on this topic real quick, Kelly. What's that? Oh, Jeffrey, yes.
Your password manager, no. Now, if you start going into things like a YubiKey and things of that nature, yes, right? That's that next wave of identity management. But a password manager in and of itself, it won't recognize it in the sense that it's not going to equate it with that website. Let's put it like that. But if you're so inclined to just go ahead and copy and put it in, which a lot of people would do, but that's a good point, right? A simple way of, it's not the real website.
So Kelly, what kind of insurance coverage is available for a ransomware attack?
So the ransomware, the coverage is there pretty comprehensively in a cyber insurance policy. So it will respond to provide you with a breach counsel, which is basically a lawyer that will help sort of quarterback the response for you, and get a forensic firm involved and get them sort of to start to identify what the source of the attack was, stop the bleeding, negotiate directly with the attackers. Sometimes that's the forensic firm. Sometimes that's a separate company that will do that negotiation. It will provide coverage for the ransom itself, so long as it's not to an entity that is on the OFAC list. So you do have to sort of watch that. They will do OFAC checks. And I have seen situations that list does change. And I have seen situations where when the ransom is paid initially, the OFAC check is done and the entity is not on that list. The company pays the ransom and then goes a month later to go retrieve the money or get reimbursement for the money from the insurance carrier. And now the entity is on the OFAC list and they cannot make the payment. So it is very dependent on that. So the coverage is pretty comprehensive. That way you even have some remediation coverage that exists to some extent in some of these policies. So it's pretty comprehensive.
Great, thank you. Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question, so let's try to end this on a positive note, right? We're talking about a lot of scary incidents here. So, Kelly, how can organizations get the best terms and price on a cyber insurance product today? Let's get this a little gift here. It's the holiday season.
Yeah, it goes back to what I've been saying all along, right? It's really about, kind of demonstrating a true commitment to data privacy and network security, showing that you are putting the right controls in place, that you are focused on that you're being attentive to emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, and that you're training and you're testing yourself. You're doing the fire drills yourself.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And thank you, Tom and Kelly, for your time today. So takeaways here: don't open emails you don't know. Don't answer phone calls from numbers that you don't recognize, and just be leery of every request for a transfer and anything that you do throughout the day. Thank you very much for
easy stuff.
Right?
Go back to paper.
Just don't use a computer.
So, Tom, I think I'd like to hand this back to you to introduce our last speaker of the day.
Thank you, Scott. Joe Ali would be proud. You did a nice job there, And Kelly, my doctor was Dr. Francis Geary in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, in the old days. So I guess batting cleanup, coming out of the bullpen. He has time for once. As I mentioned before, his nickname within the firm is Mr. IRS, but probably, in my opinion, the most knowledgeable. Don't let this go to your head, Gary. Tax exempt person probably in the country when it comes to dealing with the IRS, Attorney General's offices, different announcements, tax regulations, rules, etc. Garrett heads up our whole tax exempt practice. He has 35 people or so that just work under him, just doing 990s and tax compliance, tax research, tax studies, solely in the not-for-profit sector. Garrett, all yours.
Right, thanks. So it's always tough to follow Tom. Such an interesting, scary topic of cyber. He scares me enough that I have about 12 computers in my house. Each one has a specific transaction. I have one for emails, one for banking, one for paying my Orange and Rockland utility bill. All kidding aside, Tom, where did you go? You had to. No, you, Tom. You didn't introduce my credential. I am a CPA, but you forgot about the VETC. I'm a very ethical tax compliance expert. Since we're making up credentialing, but one more thing, I do have a bachelor's of arts in accounting and information systems. The problem was, by the time I graduated, the information system was outdated already and obsolete. So if anybody wants help processing their Lotus 123 notes, see me after. All right, now I'll get into my, we have a little thing. Last week we didn't have this thing here. Hold on. All right, there we go. We're going to get into tax compliance for private foundations. All right, we're going to cover quickly the IRS Priority Guidance Plan. We're going to go through current developments and initiatives and emerging tax issues. So, let's see. All right, we got a little delay here. So last week, I actually presented here at our exempt tax conference and went over a little different priority, but it's the same priority guidance, but for tax exempt organizations, charities, etc. And a couple things that you may want to note as private foundations, funders of certain charitable organizations. I went over, they came up with some DAF regulations, donor advised fund regulations, talked about the excise tax on taxable distributions in that regard. Supporting organizations, another type of charitable organization. There are different types. Some types can be funded by private foundations, but there were some regs published there regarding permissible and non-permissible gifts, the definition of control, the definition of integral part test, what makes a supporting organization support other charitable organizations, as well as the responsiveness test. And also, there was a lot of critiquing on hospitals and how they're not doing enough charity care. In fact, they actually looked at the larger systems and they said maybe charity care was 2% of the billions of dollars hospitals make, and compared them to for-profit hospitals. So those are some, areas of focus, as well as political activities. Right, we're heading into a political season again. You got to watch who you fund, how you fund, what they're doing with the money you're giving them. But now, on to private foundations. So the IRS has plans to leverage technology. You heard me say this last year, and they're doubling down on it, and I see it in action. They have mandatory e-filing now for all exempt organizations, including private foundations. So they're going to be data mining. They're going to be drawing up new technologies, creating programs to identify non-compliance, whether it's within the private foundation world or the private foundation as an entity as a whole, 1099 compliance. Are you issuing W-2s and 1099s to the same individuals, et cetera? So that's one of the areas they're going to be focusing on. The IRS is prioritizing issuing guidance on the 4941 regarding a private foundation's investment in partnerships in which disqualified persons are also partners. They used to call it, there's one ruling out there called co-investing, and they said it's not self-dealing. The IRS is actively re-looking at that case. And I have seen this through my career where the IRS rules on something and years later they say, we no longer agree with that ruling. We disagree with ourselves and we're going to change it. So that's something to watch, okay? Because they no longer believe in the co-investing is not self-dealing. So we're going to see what happens there. They're actively approving regulations under the unrelated business income tax regs. Under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, they had the separate reporting of unrelated business income activities. So in the past, prior to 2018, you had all these different sources of revenue, unrelated business income. You could net it all and whatever it came out to be, income or expense, that's what it was. In 2008, they passed the silo regs. The silo regs basically said, if you have multiple trades or businesses, you have to silo them on each island. So no longer can you net the income and the losses from different types and come up maybe with a loss. If you have an activity with income and you have an activity with loss, the activity loss gets suspended, the activity with income creates an income tax situation. The one thing they fell short of was giving guidance on expenses, okay, as well as net operating losses. So the ruling right now is if you had unrelated net operating losses that was pre-2018, you could offset any type of activity. Any losses that post-2018, you only can offset income from that activity, okay? What the IRS didn't really say was, how do you approach a net operating loss that was when you have two different activities? Maybe one with a loss, one with income, okay? You would think, oh, I can take the against my income. It's not so fast. The IRS is actually coming out with rules where they're probably going to make you prorate that. So if your activity with a loss generates so much income, a portion of that loss is going to be suspended. You're not going to be able to use the whole loss against the activity with income. So, and the same thing goes with expenses. So they're actively, part of their plan is to come out with guidance on how to apply the NOLs as well as apply expenses to your separate silos. All right, we're on to current developments and initiatives. All right, so IRS issued technical guidance TG 58 excise tax on self-dealing. This is an area that they're focusing on again. As we know that, typically dealings with foundation managers and private foundations or disqualified persons, which are more than just your foundation managers, family members, businesses with foundations, are prohibited. There are very little exceptions, compensation being one of them, as long as it's reasonable. We all know that one. This guidance basically talks about the history, the purpose of the self-dealing, and goes through specific examples of direct and indirect self-dealing, including the investing portion, although no rulings in there. Talks about the potential for self-dealing. The taxes imposed. So the taxes imposed, first thing you got to remember, there's no de minimis amount of self-dealing. If you have a self-dealing, it is self-dealing. You have to go ahead and incur it and pay it back. And there may be taxes on the self-dealer in the amount of 10%, as well as foundation managers who knowingly approve that, which would be 5% of the self-dealing. In addition, you have to unravel that self-dealing. So it's a pretty complicated law. It talks about how they're going plans to enforce it, as well as examinations for and audit tips for agents. So it's kind of a guideline. So if your organization should take a look at this publication, should make sure they're tracking the disqualified person list, and try to mitigate things or nip it in the bud, as you so to speak. The other thing I want to bring to your attention, I brought it up last year, but I see it active, is the deactivation of inactive accounts of the EFTPS system. So if you're a foundation that maybe has a huge overpayment, all right, hasn't made an estimated tax payment in a while. When you go back and try to make that estimated tax payment, you may have a problem with the EFTPS being deactivated. The problem is now you have to reapply, and it takes a long process. So just keep that in mind. Make sure you keep it current. The only way to keep it current is really to use it. So I don't know. It's kind of an inherent problem with the IRS. Last thing I'll also mention is an update, organizational information on Form 8822B. What the IRS has been experiencing, especially with revocations, is they mail they send notices or correspondence to private foundations that may have listed a foundation manager that hasn't been there in a while. In order to update your responsible person at your organization, you may want to fill out this form. It's also, if you move locations, this is the form you fill out. So what the IRS has been actively asking clients to do is to fill out this form to just refresh the responsible person. So this way you can ensure that any correspondence gets to where it's going, going where it needs to go. Cryptocurrency. I think I mentioned this last year, but we're seeing a lot of stuff being come out a little bit more now. So cryptocurrency is not currency, okay? It is property. So therefore, receiving a contribution of cryptocurrency is like receiving a non-cash property, okay? So if it's over $500, you need to fill out an 8283 if you're the donor. As a recipient foundation, you would need to sign off saying, acknowledging you received it, okay? If it's over $5,000, the donor needs to have a valuation, okay? But if you're going to hold it as a private foundation, you also need to value it, right? When you're calculating your distribution requirements. The guidance that's come out is IRC section 170F11E2. I guess it's not that at all important. Basically gives the criteria for a valid deduction by using an expert, and the individual has to be have a verifiable education and experiencing value in the type of property. So if that person is needed to value it for deduction purposes, that person's also needed to value it when valuing it for the fair market value for your distribution requirements. If you do hold cryptocurrency, sorry. Increased focus on exams of high income taxpayers with tax exempt entity issues, including foundations, tax filings being pulled into examinations. This is usually the family office. They're going to pull in, they're going to look at the individual, the businesses, if you have foreign bank accounts, all that stuff. but they're also starting to pull in these foundations of these individuals to look at the charitable deductions they're taking, et cetera, and how they're funding it. This is specifically important when the estates and trusts as well. A lot of times, are you following the proper protocols of leaving money in, that was meant for the foundation? Is it going there? Is it valued properly? And stuff like that. Yes. With the cryptocurrency, since it's property, is there any chance of classifying it as charitable? So I would say normally, and the question is, could cryptocurrency be viewed as charitable use property as opposed to non-charitable use property, which is mostly investment property? So obviously, the IRS has ruled it is not investment property. Could it be? You'd have to prove that it's really used, substantially in your purpose of your organization. So if it's just held as an investment, I'm going to say it's probably not. It's like artwork. Artwork can be if you're an art organization, but if you hold artwork and you're not really exhibiting it and stuff, it may not be. Cryptocurrency, how would you, what argument would you make to say that it was related to your program, your purposes? Yeah, collateral for a loan. I don't know if it's going to qualify, but yet it's uncharted territory. So, you'd have to, in order to take the position, you'd have to look at all the facts and circumstances of your particular situation and draw some, proximate and primary purpose to your mission. So the increased scrutiny, this was on the priority guidance list. There's a lot of stuff stays in the priority guidance list until they get around to issuing guidance. That's why some of the stuff is a repeat from the prior year. Something else I've seen that's interesting is taxable expenditures, specifically grants to individuals. Now, private foundations, when they're giving grants to individuals primarily for travel, study, or other similar purposes, a foundation needs prior approval. This is sometimes done during the application process when you're receiving your exempt status. If it's not, it can be requested by filing a miscellaneous determination of Form 8940 after the fact. But in either case, you need permission from the IRS of your process for issuing these grants. Otherwise, it can be considered a taxable expenditure. So grants that meet all the following requirements are not taxable expenditures. One, the foundation awards the grants on an objective and non-discriminatory basis. This needs to be proved to the IRS. The grant is a scholarship or fellowship under 117A, which is your typical grant, scholarships, et cetera, for educational purposes. Is a prize or award subject to the provisions of 174B if the recipient prize or award is selected from the general public, or to achieve a specific objective, produce a report or similar product, or improve, enhance a literary, artistic, musical, scientific teaching, or other similar skill or talent of a recipient. So it has to fall into one of those three categories, in addition to being objective and non-discriminatory. Foundations give out grants because it seems like a charitable purpose, but you do need that permission beforehand. The IRS approves in advance the procedures for awarding the grant. That's the crux of it. The IRS wants to know who you're giving these scholarships to, making sure you're not giving grants back to family members, disqualified persons, etc. It's non-discriminatory. To receive approval, this prior approval, whether it's with your application for exemption or with the miscellaneous determination, to receive approval of its educational grant procedures on the Treasury Reg 534945, the grant procedure includes an objective and non-discriminatory selection process. It must be detailed description. The grant procedure results in the recipients performing the activities the grants were intended to finance, and the detail must also demonstrate the foundation plans to obtain reports to determine whether the recipient have performed the activities that the grants were intended to finance. So when you're asking for permission, that reg section defines what you need to prove to the IRS in order to get approval. On to state compliance issues. We're still dealing with a remote workforce. I don't think that's ever going to change. People are not coming always back to the office. They're in some days, they're not some days. I guess it's here to stay. Home state, we got to consider home state regulations versus other states where employees are working. Is your foundation, does they have to register in those states, withhold taxes in those states, et cetera? States are becoming similar to New York. New York always had the convenience of the employer rule, which stated, if it was a New York job, although I'm letting my employee work somewhere else, if it's for the convenience of the employee, and it's really a New York job, then it should be New York tax withheld. Still, it doesn't matter where they're working. New Jersey in 2023 came out with a similar ruling. So you're starting to see states go, and I know New Jersey had, looked at New York and said, what are you doing? You can't do that. But New York did. So now New Jersey came out with their own convenience of the employer rule. So going to be able to tax dollars of anybody whose business is in New Jersey, but they're working elsewhere. Okay. So you need to work with your payroll service providers and establish human resource policies around this. On to state attorney general and unrelated business income reporting. A lot of the states, because of cyber concerns, are not interfacing with tax products any longer. They're starting to say, no, go through our web portal, which makes our job as accountants harder. We used to be able to input the information to the federal return that flowed to the states. Now we have to go through a whole different portal onto the state websites. So the state of Connecticut, Iowa, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, and West Virginia. Iowa and West Virginia, really? I don't have too many that file in that state, but I do, and it can become a nuisance. And as I've seen this year in trying to file unrelated business income tax returns, it's not all user-friendly. See, because in the tax world, when you either allocate or apportion to states. When you're dealing with unrelated business income, especially private foundations usually generate unrelated business income through investments in partnerships that report various state unrelated business income. It's not easy to apportion. You don't know the payroll. You don't know the property, and all those factors. However, the state of Connecticut says you have to start with the federal number and only will allow you to apportion, not allocate. Just say, well, I'm allocating because this is what the K1 told me. Connecticut gets this piece. So how do I start from the federal? If my federal, and this is a real life example, my federal income was actually a loss. My Connecticut was income. How do I do it? And it's not going to let me put a negative apportionment factor in. But when we called up Connecticut, they're like, yeah, we're getting a lot of calls from accountants. They're not happy. Really? So what do? I had to trick the system, put a positive number in representing the federal number to be the state number, but technically not correct. Somebody's going to look at the copy of the federal return that needs to be attached and say, wait a second, that's not the federal number. But these are just the beginning of problems we're seeing. So it's new. It's a new phase, and I'm waiting to see other states follow suit. So basically, it's a lot more time as a private foundation who invests in all these K1s. Not only are we going through K1s, we're going through foreign filings. We're quantifying your UBIT, breaking out all your state allocations, etc. But now we have to separately prepare your federal return in a tax software system, and now go to each state and now manually input all the information again. We might as well just use a typewriter. But that's how it looks right now. What it's also doing on the state attorney general side, the state of New York, the Char 500 needs to be filed electronically. So when we as tax preparers go in, we can put all the numbers in and we can check all the boxes. Then we hit the two signatories and it's sent off into cyberspace. As a client, you need to be aware that that email is coming from the New York State Attorney General. You have to actually get the signatures, electronic signatures, and send it back. Otherwise, we cannot file that return. So it's been causing a lot of delays because things are getting trapped in spam filters and whatnot. It's just something that needs to be worked out. I guess a few years from now, hopefully it'll all be ironed out, but right now it's causing delays. So just keep in mind that the states are going to these web portals. All right, so going on to some emerging tax issues that we're seeing here. So that's my artwork there. Tax to the future, like Back to the Future. You like that? Trends and focus, future focus. So the IRS strategic operating plan, they do have a plan. The plan was to bolster the ranks, look at the employee retention credits, and get to everything else. They plan on using smarter enforcement, using technology driven. It's no longer going to be sending, hey, we're coming out to look at you. It's going to be specific industry, specific issue driven. If your return gets filed and it throws off an anomaly, you most likely will get a letter on that particular issue. So it's good because it's very focused and it could lead to actual examination. So they're using enhanced technology analytics. They want to try to, I guess, issue faster issue resolutions, letters, closing letters, etc. That's their goal. But they do have a lot of newly trained agents. So every time that the issue comes up, we're dealing with an agent. Maybe 50% of the time, I have to go to their managers because they're not understanding the regulations. They haven't been in it long enough. Maybe they're taken from payroll and brought into foundations. This is the issues that I'm experiencing. But they do have a plan. They're trying to work towards it. If it works out, I think things will go smoother. But I think they're going to have to get over the newly trained agents. That's the way, what I see at least. Examination issues that I'm seeing that are identified this year included unrelated business income. Again, through the partnerships, make sure you're reporting your unrelated business income. Everything's electronic now. Most K1s have a code 20V, as in Victor. It usually reports it. This enables the IRS to easily pick up those UBIT numbers. It's just a matter of time before they start matching, okay? I foresee that in the future. Excise taxes, again, self-dealing, that's one of the areas. The other type of excise tax I see is the compensation, excessive compensation, the 4720 if you're over $1 million. If you have individuals, foundation managers that, and you're a corporate foundation, you have to consider that individual's corporate, you may have to consider, I should say, that individual's corporate salary as part of that $1 million. And that corporation, believe it or not, may actually have to pay its pro rata share on that 4720. So there's still some issues there. But I have been seeing some notices saying you were close to that $1 million. You know, did you file the 4720? That's one of the areas of excise tax I see. Employment tax issues, including employment misclassification. Again, the IRS catches when you issue a W-2 and a 1099 to the same person. Now, there could be valid reasons for it, but expect the question if that happens. So you may want to catch that in the front. Make sure you have your agreements papered up. Right? A lot of times we see when a foundation manager leaves, but will still be around to guide the organization's transition, that person may actually have an independent contractor agreement. It's totally permissible, but when you're looking at that independent contractor agreement, it cannot be identical job duties as that person when they were an employee. If it is, most likely they're going to say, no, this is all W-2 based wages, and you should have withheld payroll taxes, etc. And taxable fringe benefits. You really can't be an independent contractor and receive fringe benefits, medical, dental. That's the sign of an employee. And we still see that, believe it or not, issues on those types of things. The Inflation Reduction Act, okay? I know we talked a little bit about the agents and the money going into the IRS to hire the agents and improve technology, but something else is emerging as we're starting to see, these energy tax credits. So basically there are two different types I'm going to focus on. There's the investment tax credit. So foundations who invest in private foundations may be able to take this tax credit. It's a refundable credit. as well as other nonprofit group. And there's production tax credits. The production tax credits are could be generated through investments, but also if you have a private foundation, a private operating foundation that is enhancing their technology, whether they're building, they're using smart energy, solar, wind, stuff like that. Those credits will be refundable. Okay, they are called direct pay refunds. So there's a streamlined process for tax exempt, including foundations, to claim those credits. And the last thing is the possible transferability and monetization of that transferability of those credits. So if you are a private operating foundation, you have a big renovation, you may be able to there's certain credits that you may be able to allow your construction or your architect to take, in hopes that you can negotiate a lower fee for that. Although they are not credits that the foundation or not the tax exempt can take, you may be able to transfer them to whoever's doing the construction, etc., and negotiate. So that there's also, keep that in mind. There's a lot of credits out there. So if you do have a renovation, or if you are looking at your K1s, look and hone in on these energy credits to see if they're direct refund or you can use them as a negotiation piece. The Secure Act 2.0 really didn't have much impact. It's really more focused on retirements, but the one impact it may have is if you have a 403B plan, you may need to update it. There are certain requirements. The IRS is trying to bring 403B plans and 401k plans in line with each other regarding hardship distributions and other types of language that are required. So it's also designed to encourage participation in retirement savings, etc. But it will require you to revisit your plan documents and update them. So what can foundations do to prepare? Obviously, first and foremost, prepare a complete and accurate return. If it has a red flag on it, most likely you'll be getting a letter. That's how they're operating now, the IRS. If you're reporting things differently than other foundations of similar size demographic areas, you may get a letter in the mail as well. Review the alternative investments and properly report unrelated business income under the new silo rules. Obviously, you have to pay attention to the NOL rules and the guidance coming out on allocation of expenses between the silos. And obviously, consider the flow-through energy credits that are reported on the K1, because you may be able to take them as a refundable credit. Foundations have always been advised to keep this current disqualified persons list. I know sometimes it gets lost. Sometimes we ask and they have to recreate it. And depending on how old the foundation is, or how many board members or foundation managers, it can be pretty large. So make sure you keep up with that disqualified person list, review your transactions, and then you should really look at investments side by side if it applies to you, and keep an eye on that on the rulings coming out, and guidance, new guidance that the IRS is intended to issue regarding those side by side investments. Review compensation arrangements and update retirement plans. Self-explanatory there. And maintain good records that support positions taken. A lot of times when we're talking about, it comes down to record maintenance, because a lot of times when the IRS looks at an issue, it's not till years down the road. If you don't keep the records now, and you won't have them, you have to recreate them. It becomes a little bit harder. The other thing is guidance on the states is currently coming out too. You have to watch all the states that you're operating or in, or you may be doing business in. Maintain good records that support positions taken. Your crypto, right? The valuations, who you're using, how you come up with it. Obviously your estates and high net worth individuals. If you have family offices, you got to make sure you're maintaining the records there, keeping the walls up between businesses, looking at that, watching who your organization is supporting. is, are you paying pledges of the individual rather than of the foundation? EFTPS, always keep that in the forefront as well. And review, again, your retirement plans to make sure that the Secure Act 2.0 provisions get in there. There was one thing that I had here. I think it may have eliminated or skipped over. Here it is. Sorry. The accelerating the ACE Act. We all know the ACE Act wasn't passed into legislation. Okay, and the ACE Act brought out two things in 2022. Although it wasn't enacted into law, it focused in on distributions of foundations to donor-advised funds, as well as the salaries and travel expenses paid to foundation managers. Okay, if you fast forward to 2023, you have the president's Green Book proposal, or should I call it the Treasury Green Book proposal. It actually takes one piece out of the ACE Act and basically focuses and will primarily disallow distribution to donor-advised funds. That's the one thing they will have. So if a foundation at the end of the year wants to fund the donor-advised funds, it will not count as a qualifying distribution. There's variations of it. Outright not count, or it won't count unless that donor-advised fund pays out the funds within the year after the funds were received from the private foundation. So it's something that is still lingering around. One part seems to have gone away at least for the time being, but the donor-advised fund piece is still there. And that kind of concludes my presentation and tax update for this year.
So with that, we do have some questions I know that have come in online, but we're running a little over. So what we'll do is we'll direct them to the individual who can best answer them, and we'll get back to you. Want to thank everybody who showed up and stayed till the end, both in the room and online. Our 16th annual Private Foundation Symposium. Time goes like that, and we look forward to seeing you next year. Want to thank Paul and Kelly and Scott and Tom and Garrett for speaking today, as well as the entire PF team that's spread out here, as well as our marketing and administrative support who make this happen, because there's a lot of work that goes into it. We have to make sure Gary stays entertained for 2 hours. We welcome your feedback. If you have any feedback, that was payback for an earlier comment Gary made to me. If you have any feedback for next year, please share it. Topics, are you tired of hearing from Tom every year? But it's all good what he shares, and thank you.